Hey everybody, this is a review of the Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, edited by Sean Matgamna. This review is by Ed Maltby. Paul Blanc's review of the Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, is a thoughtful and detailed piece. Blanc defends the two Trotskyisms against some on the left who deride the book as pointless, obsessing over it long ago spats. He is right to do it. Such complaints remind me of Homer Simpson, who warned that he's late for English class, sneers, "Poof, English who needs that? I'm never going to England." The truth is that the two Fate of the Russian Revolution books are about the Trotskyist movement as it is right now. They are not just scholarly works about distant long-ago arguments. They trace the development of a pattern of thought and behavior that shape how our movement thinks and works today. In particular, they look at the development of what workers' liberty has called, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote. LeBlanc focuses his review on the 1940s dispute over the class character of the USSR, weighing the merits of third camp views that see the USSR as a new form of class society, be it capitalist or something else, against the orthodox view of the USSR as still a quote, worker state, end quote, albeit degenerated. LeBlanc deals with the subject matter in a tone of ecumenical and scholarly tact, but there can be no mistaking that LeBlanc means to defend Cannon against Shachtman and enlists, quote, state capitalist, end quote, theorist Tony Cliff to help him out. For LeBlanc, Cannon's approach, which is to say Trotsky's approach, quote, continues to have much to recommend it, end quote. And whereas the survival of the Cannon group vindicates the Cannon's ideas, the disintegration of the Shachtman group and Shachtman's personal rightward lurch in later life offer proof of the weakness of the, quote, third camp, end quote, tradition. The first thing to reply to LeBlanc, and this is a key theme of the book, is this. Cannon's 1940 politics on the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, were not the same as Trotsky's 1939-40 politics. Cannon traveled, in less than a year after Trotsky's death, far from Trotsky's position. LeBlanc accepts Matgamna's contention that, quote, Trotsky constantly rethought, reconceptualized, readjusted his thinking on the USSR, end quote, through the 1930s, but he says this process of analysis, quote, culminated, end quote, in Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, written in 1935-6 and published in spring 1937. But Trotsky's 1937 book was far from Trotsky's final word. After its publication, Trotsky continued to shift his emphasis, contradict his previous writings, and speculate as to whether or not the USSR should be considered a new form of class society. In an April 1939 article, Trotsky urgently raised the slogan of an independent Ukraine. Trotsky pointed out, but refused to draw, the logical conclusion that the USSR's behavior in Ukraine should be called imperialist. In his September 1939 article, The USSR in War, which is up on this channel, Trotsky remarked that to give the USSR bureaucracy the label of a new ruling class would be a, quote, purely verbal, end quote, a, quote, purely verbal, end quote, change. The distance between Trotsky's view and the view of the Soviet bureaucracy as a new class was narrowing. Trotsky resisted taking the final step. Why? It seems that foremost in Trotsky's mind was this. When the expected crisis of the Soviet regime came, the Trotskyists in Russia must be ready to lead the fight against capitalist restoration and turn this into a struggle for workers' power. They must not say, quote, a plague on both your houses, bureaucrat and capitalist alike, end quote. Trotsky. Maybe that's not a Trotsky quote. Maybe that's just a quote saying, giving an idea of, I don't know, like a paraphrase, but there's quotations marks. Sorry, I'm lost. Let me repeat the last sentence. It seems that foremost in Trotsky's mind was this. When the expected crisis of the Soviet regime came, the Trotskyists in Russia must be ready to lead the fight against capitalist restoration and turn this into a struggle for workers' power. They must not say, quote, a plague on both your houses, bureaucrat and capitalist alike, end quote. He resisted any theoretical expression that might lull the Trotskyists into sectarian abstention from an expected struggle. Calling the USSR a new class society might be reasonable in theory, but it might be premature and it might encourage dangerous conclusions. Trotsky's concerns and his method were rooted in the changing situation of 1939 and his attempt to chart a course for the global revolutionary movement through the hard months before, as he saw, new choices were bound to emerge. After Trotsky died, on the 21st of August 1940, the Cannon leadership flash froze his writings into a dogma, and in so doing changed their dynamic, content, and meaning. For Cannon, and for the majority of the post-Trotsky Trotskyist movement, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, changed from a perspective that assumed the imminent collapse of the USSR into a timeless moral obligation on socialists to laud the sole characteristic that gave Stalin's regime, otherwise described by Trotsky as differing from fascism, quote, only in its more unbridled savagery, end quote, its, quote, proletarian character, end quote, that is, nationalized industry. One second. Sorry, one second. I want to copy that. Back to the text. As the Stalinist system confounded Trotsky's predictions by surviving the war and spread across the world, the label, quote, degenerated, end quote, or, quote, deformed, end quote, worker state came to be given to any state at any time whose leadership paid sufficient lip service to the October Revolution and or nationalized the economy. As Shachtman commented, this changed Lenin's slogan from, quote, Soviets plus electrification equals socialism, end quote, to, quote, totalitarian prison for the workers plus nationalized property equals a degenerated worker state, end quote. The key protagonist in this view of the world ceased to be the working class, but had become the institution of nationalized property, a progressive force regardless of who brought it into being or defended it, be they Gaddafi, Castro, Mao, Tito, or even the Syrian Ba'athists and the Burmese junta. All would find themselves feted by, quote, Orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists at some point in the post-war period and declared candidates for, quote, unconditional defense, end quote. The gulf that separates the Orthodox and heterodox Trotskyists is substantial, but it is not a boundary separating Trotsky's position from something else. It is between two strands that both departed from Trotsky's positions of the 1930s because new events made those positions inoperable. Cannon's departure from Trotsky's position defined, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, for generations of revolutionaries, and not only in terms of his theory of nationalized property. The cultural shift in Cannon's Socialist Workers' Party also provided the model for the internal regime of most post-Trotsky Trotskyist organizations. Trotsky had always accepted that if reality changed, so should the parameters of rational socialist debate. In 1934, Trotsky had written that, quote, denying the proletarian character of the USSR is incompatible with membership in the Bolshevik Leninists, end quote. No compromise on the Russian question. But in 1939, after observing 5 years of subsequent developments, he would call it, quote, a piece of monstrous nonsense to split with comrades who on the question of the sociological nature of the USSR have an opinion different from ours, insofar as they solidarize with us in regard to the political tasks, end quote. When Trotsky died, this is a thought to myself. It seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert, I'm learning about this stuff, but it seems to me that the minority that Trotsky's criticism in defense of Marxism of the minority tendency around Shachtman and James Burnham and Joseph Carter and other people, they actually did disagree with Trotsky on the political tasks in terms of what degree, if any, the USSR should be defended, including defended in its expansionist drives in Poland and Finland. Okay. When Trotsky died, Cannon built his leadership around the prestige of being Trotsky's legatee, rather as Peter, foremost disciple of Jesus, who had become the first pope. The tone was set by Cannon's bizarre and unsuccessful bid to have Trotsky's remains flown to New York for a memorial meeting held by the American group, the Socialist Workers' Party. The prestige of the Cannon leadership required that Trotsky's writings be turned from the living documents into a source of scriptural authority, to be quoted from in order to support this or that position held by the leadership. In 1945, Felix Mars summed up the changes, quote, Trotsky created an atmosphere of free exchange of ideas, of hospitality to attempts to find what is new in a situation, ... After his death, however, the political committee majority tended ... to create a very different atmosphere, end quote. For me, it doesn't seem like that is actually the case. It seems like Trotsky created a rather poisonous atmosphere, if the text from In Defense of Marxism are any indication. That's just me. From here on in, as Matgamna puts it, quote, Marxism as a process of scientific investigation had come to an end, end quote. Insistence on the literal truth of all Trotsky's predictions and formulas became a, quote, matter of principle, end quote. In November 1945, Cannon would declare that only, quote, careless thinkers, end quote, could believe that the Second World War had ended, and he and his allies would defend that statement when challenged, rather than admitting it was an extravagance. Reconstruction of Europe using American money was declared a, quote, theoretical impossibility, end quote, as was the reestablishment of parliamentary democracies. This was a different kind of reasoning to what had come before, and a worse reasoning. Blanc gives us an example of this kind of, quote, orthodox reasoning, quote, orthodox, end quote, reasoning, when he quotes Cliff against Shachtman, quote, if the Stalinist regime denotes the decline of civilization, the reactionary negation of capitalism, then it is, of course, more reactionary than the latter. Capitalism has to be defended from Stalinist barbarism, end quote. Just as a side note, there's different debates about the relationship, different thoughts about the relationship between bureaucratic collectivism and state capitalist theories. For instance, Alan Johnson talks about how in one of his pieces, I can't remember which one, how there was more overlap between the two groups than there was between the two groups and the degenerated worker state people. But also, it's important to note that in terms of organizational questions, the Cliffite tendency, the state capitalist tendency, definitely remained more influenced and in line with the organizational habits of Orthodox Trotskyism. From everything that I've read, that seems to be the case. Whereas other people who adopted a state capitalist thesis of the USSR moved into at least a more libertarian and a more libertarian direction, whether or not they called itself like that. So, for instance, the Johnson Forest tendency and the tendency around Cornelius Castoriadis. Anyway, all right, so here we go. LeBlanc summarizes Cliff's view, quote, partisans of the state capitalist theory, no less than those of the degenerated worker state perspective, have seen bureaucratic collectivism as facilitating a fatal accommodation between would-be Marxist revolutionaries and actually existing capitalism, end quote. Paul LeBlanc. It should be clear that Paul LeBlanc is involved with the collection of the writing, the gathering of the collected works of Rosa Luxemburg, which I think is a travesty. But I suppose that's what happens when you're publishing with another political travesty, Verso, which was New Left Review, which represented the more, I would say, the right wing, the orthodox of Trotsky. So people like people that would be important to that group would be people like Deutscher, Mandel, Tariq Ali, those people who held on to the degenerated worker state theory. if they're the publisher for that book, it would make sense that they would have Paul LeBlanc editing that volume. I guess I'd have to defer to Peter Hudis on that, but in terms of, he works with Paul LeBlanc on this, and Peter Hudis is not a Leninist. What was I going to say? I don't know. I guess for the purposes of actually getting the book together, it's something, but it seems like his politics are definitely not in line with Rosa Luxemburg, I would say. Yeah. Anyway, let me reread that last sentence before I trailed off. LeBlanc summarizes Cliff's view, quote, partisans of the state capitalist theory, no less than that of those of the degenerated worker state, have seen bureaucratic collectivism as facilitating a fatal accommodation between would-be Marxist revolutionaries and actually existing capitalism. End quote. LeBlanc summarizing Tony Cliff. There are, I think, three problems with this line of attack against Shachtman. First is that Cliff is effectively saying that a line of inquiry should be rejected if it threatens to produce conclusions that clash with one's pre-existing prejudices. Saying, quote, X can't be true, it's heretical, end quote, is a good way of defending orthodoxy, but it is a poor way of figuring out the truth. Secondly, as LeBlanc in fact acknowledges, it does not follow that if you think that the USSR is an exploitative class society, more reactionary than capitalism, you must become a supporter of the capitalist camp. On the other hand, Cliff in the 1940s saw the USSR's, quote, state capitalism, end quote, as a higher form of capitalism and more historically progressive than what existed in the West. Cliff was accommodating to the prevailing orthodoxy, a stance which the tendency he founded has since replaced by, quote, more anti-Stalinist, end quote, one, but never officially revised. There's a side note, in Ian Birchall's biography of Tony Cliff I haven't read the whole thing, but I read the chapter that's on the Russian question, which is what I'm interested in, and he says that Tony Cliff's appreciation of the progressive nature of the USSR is based on its creating concentration of industry, concentration of the working class, creating the conditions for working class revolution in the Soviet Union or something like that, and not some kind of value judgment about its emancipatory character in and of itself, which I don't know, maybe that's true or maybe it's not, but if you're trying to defend the Cliffite tradition to a contemporary audience who would be attracted to Cliff because of the state capitalist thesis, it would be important to cover up any shameful apologetics that Cliff may or may not have been engaged in. So it might be true, it might be the case, but I don't know. On the other hand, Cliff in the 1940s saw the USSR's, quote, state capitalism, end quote, as a higher form of capitalism and more historically progressive than what existed in the West. Cliff was accommodating to the prevailing orthodoxy, a stance which the tendency he founded has since replaced by a, quote, more anti-Stalinist, end quote, one, but never officially revised. But does this mean that Cliff saw himself as on the side of the USSR as the, quote, more progressive, end quote, camp? The problem is, weren't Stalinist societies in fact more reactionary than capitalism? Were they not, quote, worse, end quote, from a working class point of view? Without exception, Stalinist societies liquidated the workers' movement, reducing the workers' movement to semi-slavery and destroying the workers' movement's basic organizations, which are the prerequisites for socialist culture and workers' power. Couldn't agree with that more. What about the indisputable fact that whereas the Cannon group survived until the 1980s, when it formally repudiated Trotskyism as it understood it, the Shachtman group fell apart? I think the short answer is this. to this is that a doctrine which helps an organization achieve success is not necessarily the same thing as a doctrine which is founded in truth or reason. I'm going to repeat that sentence again because I think it's so important. Who's this fellow writing this? He's making some good goddamn points. I don't remember his name. That's how new this is to me. I think the short answer to this is that a doctrine which helps an organization achieve success is not necessarily the same thing as a doctrine which is founded in truth or reason. The 1950s were a period of McCarthyite reaction and small c conservative in the U.S. labor movement. They were also a period of massive Stalinist expansion. The immense success of the USSR drew many of the world's rebels. The 1950s were a period of McCarthyite reaction and small c conservatism in the U.S. labor movement. They were also a period of massive Stalinist expansion. The immense success of the USSR drew many of the world's rebels from national liberation movements to left-wing intellectuals of different stripes into the orbit of the Soviet sphere. Sometimes these new satellites were more or less reluctant, like Jean-Paul Sartre. But whatever the misgivings, it was undeniable that the major antagonist of Western capitalist imperialism in the post-war period was the Soviet Union with its colonies and clones. I'd like to know more, just for my own purposes, of the trajectory of Jean-Paul Sartre. In terms, because if based upon like the primary source documents that I know from the time of Socialissime au Barbarie, in like the late 1940s, which is only a portion of his life. He lived to like the 70s, for another 25, 30 years or something like that. He definitely had something to the effect that like pointing to the Gulag or something like that was inherently reactionary or something like that. But I'm not really sure, like I can't really speak on it too much. Like I'm not too sure of Jean-Paul Sartre's political trajectory. But I know at least at one point he was way more of a Stalinist fellow traveler than I or other people who probably think like me would feel comfortable. So anyway, sometimes these new satellites were more or less reluctant, like Jean-Paul Sartre, but whatever the misgivings, it was undeniable that the major antagonist of Western capitalist imperialism in the post-war period was the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union's colonies and clones. Unwillingly, and with many misgivings and a more honorable record than most, the Cannon tendency was drawn into this orbit, and that sustained them politically. If you could view the expansion of the Stalinist system as in some sense a vindication of revolutionary politics, or a source of hope, then regardless of whatever criticisms you might make of it, and Cannon's criticisms were trenchant and heartfelt, then that provided you with a morale-bolstering illusion. However bad things were at home internationally, the, quote, conquest of October, end quote, were on the march. Moreover, the Socialist Workers' Party USA had an internal regime which was that of a sect. But it also had the positive features of a sect. It inspired sacrifice and devotion which kept the group together. Eventually, the internal regime would, by Cannon's own account, quote, strangle the party, end quote. When a new, quote, Castroite, end quote, leadership emerged around Jack Barnes, Cannon denounced the, quote, strangling, end quote, in advance, but he had provided Barnes with the tools he needed. The Shachtman current did not have such sheltering illusions, and for both good and ill, they lacked the sectish character of the Cannon group. Their view of Stalinist rule as an expansion of anti-working class slavery was accurate, but also profoundly demoralizing. That it also swam against the stream of almost all left opinion produced difficulties. They were mistaken, perhaps understandably so, in their prediction that Stalinism was on the way to replace capitalism worldwide, led Shachtman to back U.S. imperialism against USSR imperialism. But Shachtman, one of only a few of the leading figures in the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League tendency, taking the path. Most simply assimilated into the social democracy, often without clearly repudiating their revolutionary views. Shachtman's, quote, fall, end quote, Shachtman's decision in 1962 to more or less support the CIA-sponsored invasion of Cuba is often used as a cautionary tale to warn off the curious. Shachtman made a fatal political mistake, probably born of profound demoralization and exhaustion. But Shachtman didn't abandon the camp of the working class. Shachtman became a left-wing fixer in the Socialist Party, later in the Democratic Party, and in the Civil Rights Movement. Not the renegade of popular legend, and in some ways substantially to the left of, say, Corbyn. Moreover, as Matgamna points out, Shachtman, quote, took up a relationship to U.S. capitalism paralleling that of the Cannonites to Stalinism, end quote. I think that's a very actually apt statement. Moreover, as Matgamna points out, Shachtman, quote, took up a relationship to U.S. capitalism paralleling that of Cannonites to Stalinism, end quote. Sean Matgamna. Yeah, I mean, that's to my understanding, is that, like, in terms of, like, domestic politics, I mean, this is to my understanding, I might be wrong, but to my understanding in terms of domestic politics, Shachtman was still very, very much to the left. But his anti-Stalinism, which some use the term Stalinophobia, which basically refers to, like, the rejection of Stalinism being the primary orientation of one's politics, right? So, like, it might be viewed in the same way. Like, I think that, like, a lot of political views that view themselves completely, like, negatively, right, like, tend to have this kind of problem, right? Like, there's a problem with anti-fascism above all else. There's a problem with anti-imperialism above all else. There's a problem with anti-capitalism above all else. There's a problem with anti-this, anti-that above all else. And if one of those things is anti-Stalinism, and that becomes, like, your main thing, it can, I don't know, in my opinion, it can lead you to make unbalanced, less than astute, ethically dubious political decisions, right? The Cannonites also made a big concession to imperialism, Soviet imperialism. And as early as 1941, in the Second World War, the Cannonite paper The Militant would reproduce material lifted from Stalinist propaganda outlets and declare that Russian expansion across Eastern Europe would herald revolutions. Why should this loss of political independence count for less than Shachtman's? To the end of his life, Cannon remained a working-class revolutionary. He saw himself and was a revolutionary opponent of Stalinism. But the doctrine that he taught relied on Stalinism as at some level the carrier of the fortunes of revolution. It would be translated into many different dialects throughout the history of, quote, orthodox, end quote, post-Trotsky Trotskyism, some much cruder than others. But the political edifice, the method that Cannon produced, and the style of organization, where a heresy-hunting atmosphere propped up the authority of leaderships said to be in sole possession of the truth, has been a blight on the Trotskyist movement. Blanc says that Cannon's approach has much to recommend it. I find it hard to agree. The dogma of, quote, degenerated and, quote, deformed worker states seems today to be as much a freakish historical aberration as the social systems to which it was an ideological satellite, conceived in error and maintained for reasons of sect prestige. Adaptations of it remain. The Cliffite groups around the world, for example, have much the same relation to hard-right political Islam as the Orthodox once had to the Soviet Union, but the theory itself has surely definitely failed the test of history. I'm going to repeat that because there's some good points there. Blanc says that Cannon's approach has much to recommend it. I find it hard to agree. The dogma of, quote, degenerated and, quote, deformed worker state seems today to be as much a freakish historical aberration as the social systems to which it was an ideological satellite, conceived in error and maintained for reasons of sect prestige. Adaptations of it remain. The Cliffite groups around the world, for example, have much the same relation to hard-right political Islam as the Orthodox once had to the Soviet Union, but the theory itself has definitively failed the test of history. Thanks for listening.